Hello, everyone. I'm George Rosca.
And I'm Mark Schneider.
And we want to welcome you to today's episode 51 of Say What, where we talk about the threats to our children in the public school system, including the need for parents to educate themselves by reading some good books.
That's right, George. You know, parents increasingly must equip themselves with the knowledge of not only what's going on in the public schools, but also educate themselves of how to respond. And this requires really methodical and thoughtful studying, in particular reading books that equip parents for what's happening.
Exactly, Mark. And so today we chose two books that I consider them as must-read for parents to help you understand the transgender movement, their key arguments, and how to challenge their irrational rationale.
These are classics. The first one is When Harry Became Sally by Ryan T. Anderson, and the second one is Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier.
And so the one thing that both of these had in common is at a point in time they were both taken off of Amazon.
That's right.
Because the left mob just couldn't stand the fact that somebody was willing to say, no, this doesn't make sense. Transgenderism is like completely off the charts, and we'll go into and explaining why.
In fact, the last time we checked, George, I think Ryan Anderson's book is still not available on Amazon, although Abigail Shrier's book, I think, is.
Yeah, it became back available. So here's one thing for parents to understand. That first of all, the transgender movement has completely overtaken the entire LGBTQ plus movement. So it's basically been blazing through everyone in its path by joining forces with the woke mob and really being fully integrated into the Black Lives Matter statement of faith and mission.
Yeah.
You know what was interesting to me, Mark, when, in 2020 everything erupted and then, the whole world now became acquainted with the organization Black Lives Matter. I went on their website and it just boggled me that they actually had like a faith statement.
It's amazing, but, it's not really surprising when you think about it. I mean, all of these groups are somehow connected in terms of their woke worldview, and they support one another. But it's interesting that BLM is not doing so well of late. One of its founders, Patricia Coolers, was found out to be quite an inspired capitalist, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Even though she said that both she and the co-founder, Alicia Garza, were trained Marxist, and yet it came out that at least Patricia had quite a few real estate holdings, including some very lucrative ones right here in Southern California.
Hey, she was working it in that real estate world.
She was indeed.
So let's get down into it. When Harry Became Sally, this was the first book that I read on the transgender movement. And so let's just help parents understand, who is Ryan T. Anderson?
Ryan T. Anderson is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He is quite a prolific author. He is a very accomplished thinker and writer. He was with the Heritage Foundation for a number of years, and he's a guy that's worth reading, definitely.
Yep. So what does the book cover? So here, parents, here's like a quick summary of, and this I like Ryan Anderson. I like his style of writing. Okay. He's very facts focused. So you won't see a lot of, rhetoric against the people who he's having a dialogue, I think. His book is kind of like inspiring a dialogue.
And he writes in a very neutral style. There's no hyperbole whatsoever in his books. It's very factual.
It's very accurate and accessible presentation of the scientific, medical, philosophical, and legal debates surrounding the trans phenomenon that we have been seeing now for the last 5 to 10 years. And what's also important to note is that it has been praised by experts. People who are of a certain caliber, former psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital. There was a longtime psychology professor at NYU, a professor of medical ethics at Columbia Medical School, professor of psychological and brain sciences at Boston University, a professor of neurobiology at the University of Utah, a distinguished professor at Harvard Law School, an eminent legal philosopher at Oxford, and a professor of jurisprudence at Princeton. So when you look at his book, and especially these, all of these people who have supported him, who have read thoroughly through his book from so many different angles. We're talking about the medical angle to the legal angle, to the philosophical angle. They put their stamp of approval behind this because they just saw it as such a well-written, comprehensive book.
Yeah, Ryan Anderson, typically, he really does his homework, and so the intellectual bona fides are all there in this book. So, George, there's some key questions that are being asked and answered, we think, in this book. Can a boy, for example, Ryan asks, be trapped in a girl's body? It's kind of a fundamental question. Can modern medicine, quote, reassign sex? Is it that simple? Is our sex, quote, assigned to us in the first place? What is the most loving response to a person experiencing a conflicted sense of gender? And finally, what should our law say on matters of, quote, gender identity? Pretty important questions.
Definitely. And so here are some of the key arguments that Ryan is making in trying to, provide a very solid answer to these list of questions. So the very first argument is the natural law argument, and that's kind of foundational to how you start off with all of this. Because, I've had some, lively conversations at work with others that haven't thought too long and hard about this. And the perception that I see that people have is that based on what they're hearing out in the media, oh, this is settled science. All of the new studies coming out are clearly showing, or that, hey, we just never studied this 50 years ago, so that's why we never knew about all of this. And so these very silly way of phrasing and reaching their conclusions can be debunked. And so here's one of the theses of what Ryan Anderson is going at. And he says this: the best biology, psychology, and philosophy, you can go back just a year ago to the latest studies to 100 years ago. They all support an understanding of sex as a bodily reality and of gender as a social manifestation of bodily sex.
And as much as we would like to actually read the substantive proof for these assertions, we don't have time to do that in this broadcast. But we really encourage our listeners to go to the book and find out how Mr. Anderson substantiates this claim. One of the really interesting things about the book that I found, George, was this gut-wrenching section where Harry became Sally, found in chapter 3, which narrates the stories of people who have assumed transgender identities and then later detransition to embrace their what's called natal sex.
Yeah.
Their original natural sex.
And, going back to the conversations I've had with coworkers, they would always come to this point, but from the opposite angle. They said, George, we have kids in our neighborhood who just don't behave like boys. They're girls from 3, 4, 5 years old. They gravitate towards other things. Like how can you say that their biology is just wired wrong?
Yeah.
And what they don't realize is that they've never listened to the stories of those boys and girls who have attempted to become the opposite sex.
That's right.
And the psychological and physical damage that they've experienced at the hands of willing doctors who want to go through the process of affirming every one of their, childish thoughts.
And there are plenty of stories out there. One that's chronicled in the book, but you can also find this online, is a gentleman named Walt Heyer is a key example. This is a man who transitioned as a woman pretty early in life, and he's older now. I don't know exactly how old he is, but I would say probably in his 50s or 60s, he tells a rather chilling story of what happened to him as a result of making this terrible decision to transition and the after effects it's had in his adult life.
And tying on to this point, one of the things that Ryan does a really good job of now connecting it back to parents, right? Because parents, POK is constantly talking about public schools, right? Yeah. How is this a threat in the public schools? And he brings it home for us by really exploring what is going on in the public schools and the affirmation therapy approach that the teachers' unions are imposing. It's not like, every teacher just has the option to do whatever they feel is best in that situation. No, it's a thou shalt approach by the teachers union. And so if a child comes out and says, well, I feel like I'm a girl, but they are really a boy, the teacher has no power to do anything to help that child. The only quote unquote help they are to give that child is to affirm what they say on any given day, even if that changes.
In fact, he goes into detail for what he calls the activist treatment plan for gender-confused children, and it has 4 stages of intervention that we commonly see played out in the public schools. The first one being a social transition gives the child a new name, pronouns, wardrobe, and outward presentation. Right? That's happening.
It is. It's happening all over the place. In fact, we just saw in this past couple days that Christopher Rufo just came out. I believe it's the Oakland School District in California that has secret detransition or transition closets without parental knowledge or consent.
Nope.
Teachers are shoving students in that direction.
The second step in the treatment plan is a child approaching puberty will be placed on puberty blockers to prevent the normal development of sex characteristics in the child.
And that these days, especially with more and more school districts having mental health services provided on campus, a lot of that by very prominent hospitals. For example, here in Orange County, we have Chalk Hospital, who already has a contract with 8 of the 28 school districts in Orange County. They do that.
Yeah, it's happening.
It's happening without parental consent.
And it gets worse. And as Mr. Ryan Anderson points out, number 3, at the age of 16, the child is given cross-sex hormones. Boys, he says, will be given feminizing hormones such as estrogen, and girls will be given masculinizing hormones such as androgens, like testosterone. In boys, his therapy renders a higher-pitched voice, breast growth, and a feminine body shape. In girls, this therapy renders a lower voice, atrophying of breast tissue, and body hair growth.
And this is where we really start to get into the physical and psychological damage part, because these children are trying to navigate in their bodies what the confusion in their brain is telling them.
That's right. And there's a lot of peer pressure, too, because their friends are doing it as well. And finally, the 4th stage, George, that Ryan Anderson points out is at age 18, these individuals are often given the option to undergo sex reassignment surgery, which involves, of course, amputation of primary and secondary characteristics and plastic surgery to create new characteristics. In fact, for girls, it's often termed top surgery. You use your imagination to guess what that means.
Yes. So parents, this is going to be the transition now from what Ryan so eloquently elaborates in his book to the next book. And this book, like when I started reading it, I just could not put it down. It's Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier. And she very narrowly focuses her entire book on a very interesting phenomena within the transgender movement. So she doesn't take this global, holistic, legal, philosophical, medical approach. She really focuses on the sociological and the medical stuff that's going on for a particular segment of our population.
Yeah, a little bit about Abigail. She's an award-winning journalist and best-selling author of this book, among others, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. And this is a fairly recent book, George, 2020. She's a graduate of Columbia, University of Oxford, and Yale Law School. So this is a very bright woman. And her work regularly appears in the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and many other publications.
And, about a couple months ago, we shared the story that she blew open about the Salinas School District in Monterey area.
That's right.
Here in California, where basically two teachers that are part of the teachers union, the California Teachers Union had a conference in Palm Springs in the late summer, I think early fall of 2021. And they were teaching other teachers how to set up gender clubs without notifying parents.
Yeah, that's right. In between writing her books, I mean, she is an accomplished journalist, and she has a very wide network of parents across the country who are feeding her this information that she follows up on. George, she also talks about something called social contagion. I love that term, because that's exactly what's going on here. Social contagions are historical phenomenon, and crazes a sociological category. The 1980s saw an endemic, for example, of teenage anorexia. Numerous kids in East Africa were afflicted by this laughter epidemic way back in 1962. Mm-hmm. Some listeners may be aware of that, where 14 schools were closed. So that same social contagion is going on with people identifying with the opposite sex. Yes.
And this is what really triggered her to go into this direction, because of all things, as a writer, and I've gotten the opportunity to talk to Abigail Shrier. She's not a Christian. She's not here to write something to purport a certain worldview.
She doesn't have an axe to grind.
Exactly. What bothered her was that so many parents were starting to call her up and say, Abigail, listen to my story. And the story seemed to be the same over and over.
Yeah.
I am a wealthy, white, middle-aged woman, mother. I have a daughter. I am a Hillary Clinton supporter. My daughter is now a teenager, gone through puberty already. And all of a sudden, one day, without me knowing, she just comes home and she says, I'm no longer a girl. I'm a boy, Mom.
Yeah.
Call me by this name. And then their relationship, even in the cases where those moms were supportive of this, the relationship goes sideways. And after hearing story after story after story about this, she started to dig into it to see if she really wanted to, research this. And what she found was that pre-2010, all of the data that we had was that the way gender dysphoria would manifest itself would be typically the vast majority in prepubescent boys. And all of a sudden, post-2010...
It switched.
Yeah. It switched. And it switched dramatically towards girls who are teenagers who are either going through puberty or have already gone through puberty. And she's like, what is causing such a radical shift? You have to explain it scientifically and medically somehow. And so when she saw that, that's when she started working on this book. And so one of the very first things probably that I think she talks about in her book is this important study by Dr. Lisa Littman at Brown University, very reputable university, where Dr. Lisa Littman was studying this effect. And she labeled it as rapid onset gender dysphoria.
It's a good term of art. And in fact, in the book, Abigail points out that the transgender craze phenomena, especially among teens, has gone up very dramatically. In fact, the number being referred for gender treatment has increased by more than 1,000% in the United States and more than 3,000% in the UK, where this has been studied.
Yeah.
So the numbers are shocking.
Yeah. So here is Dr. Lisa Littman on rapid onset gender dysphoria, and I just want to read the purpose of the study and the conclusion of the study. So the purpose, she says, in online forums, parents have been reporting that their children are experiencing what is described here as rapid onset gender dysphoria, appearing for the first time during puberty or even after its completion. The onset of gender dysphoria seemed to occur in the context of belonging to a peer group where one, multiple, or even all of the friends have become gender dysphoric.
Social contagion.
And transgender identified during the same time frame. Parents also reported that their children exhibited an increase in social media internet use prior to disclosure of a transgender identity. The purpose of this study was to document and explore these observations and describe the resulting presentation of gender dysphoria, which is inconsistent with existing research literature. Yeah. And so here's the conclusion that Dr. Lisa Littman reached. Rapid onset gender dysphoria describes a phenomenon where the development of gender dysphoria is observed to begin suddenly during or after puberty in an adolescent or young adult who would not have met criteria for gender dysphoria in childhood. So we're talking about girls who for 12 years, 14 years, 16 years even, exhibited zero symptoms of gender dysphoria as it had always been understood by the literature and by science and medicine. So check this out. Rapid onset gender dysphoria appears to represent an entity that is distinct from the gender dysphoria observed in individuals who have previously been described as transgender. The worsening of mental well-being and parent-child relationships and behaviors that isolate adolescent and young adults from their parents, families, non-transgender friends, and mainstream sources of information are particularly concerning. And here's what her last sentence says. More research is needed to better understand this phenomenon, its implication, and scope. Dr. Lisa got, ran over by the mob in social media back at the end of 2018 when this study came out. And so parents, one of the key things that Abigail links here is that social media is the avenue by which young girls are being targeted by these transgender YouTube stars who are basically grooming and teaching young girls how to hate themselves, hate their bodies. She calls the book Irreversible Damage because so many of these girls go on to get not just the puberty blockers if they started early enough, in puberty, but then they go to the cross-sex hormones because most of them have completed puberty, and then they go actually to the genital mutilation stage of top surgery and other things to try and become what they are not biologically. And it is been going through so rapidly all across the country.
So parents, please do buy these books and educate yourself. POK highly recommends these. Again, the first one is When Harry Became Sally by Professor Ryan T. Anderson, and the second one is Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier. You will be astonished by what you learn. That's all the time we have for today, George. So until next time, we'll see you soon.
Take care.